just as a beginning of the conversation, to set the frame, the world's energy mix has seen an extraordinary rise in clean energy. We know about the numbers. Last year saw the biggest investment in clean energy in human history, more so than in fossil fuels. But if you look at the share of primary energy, still about 80% of global primary energy comes from fossil fuels, about the same as it was 30 years ago. Not a lot of change. The pie has grown a lot bigger, obviously, so all the growth has come pretty much from zero carbon energy. But this is a massive inertia legacy system you're dealing with. So tell us your ideas. How are we going to change this, and how are you bringing to bear business model innovation and technological innovation to this?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the name of this summit is slightly misleading, actually. Forgive me for the feedback. But the reality is the word transition, energy transition, suggests that we are merely changing the source of fuel that goes into our energy system. But the reality is we're building a new energy system. The one we're building, the new one, is fundamentally based around electrification. Electrification is this, I think 2023, 24 are the years in which it became clear what the path to clean energy looks like. And it looks complicated before. It is now really simple. It's just electrify everything we can and then make as much of that electricity as possible from from renewables, not from fossil fuels.
So this has been the mantra for some time. I provoked the ire of a number of hydrogen and CCUS activists a couple of weeks ago when I wrote a story about electrifying heavy industry in The Economist that got some attention, suggesting that actually even these hard-to-abate sectors, too hard to use electricity, it was argued, because of high-temperature heat. Actually, we now have a number of promising technologies that could allow electrification to advance even in heavy industry, as a complement to hydrogen and CCUS, not instead of, but just another tool in the toolbox. And I was a little bit surprised by how visceral the reaction was. I'm curious, what do you think about the idea of perhaps a limit to electrification, the argument that's made as a counter-argument, that you can't electrify everything, it's too hard, that the grid is too small, we don't have enough energy, we can't count on infinite clean energy being available on demand 24/7. You're sort of hand-waving magically, saying everything will be solved by electricity. When you hear that kind of criticism, how do you respond?
I mean, look, first of all, I think there's a fundamental mistake being made by governments and indeed much of the media and a lot of other stakeholders in society that the existing energy companies are the ones that should be trusted with the transition. Now, that's not to say I don't trust them. It's simply to say that, for example, if we'd asked, I don't know, the newspaper companies to deal with the information revolution to create the internet, today we'd have printers that churned out paper copies of newspapers. We wouldn't have mobile devices you flick through in your hand. In almost every major industrial revolution, the people that ran the old technology are not the ones that will run the new. And so I think what we need to understand here is that if you ask fossil fuel companies how to clean things up, their answer is to add more to the system, to add CCUS, for example, as opposed to take something away from the system, which is to take away burning stuff.
Right.
And now, as soon as you get your head around this mindset that we actually can do most of our transport and heating needs without burning stuff, so you begin to unlock a much cheaper path. I mean, after all, look, today, everyone in this room, I assume, knows that in most parts of the world, most of the time, it's cheaper to create electricity from solar and wind than it is from fossil fuels. So we have a world in which the economics of generating electrons are superior from renewable sources. And by the way, they're getting cheaper every year. Now we can talk about short-term blips in, for example, offshore wind caused by inflation and interest rates, by the way, caused by fossil fuels. But the big picture is clear that renewables are cheaper and getting cheaper every year. And that goes for almost every bit of the technology stack. So, for example, lithium-ion batteries are 93% cheaper than they were when they were first introduced. They're getting cheaper at, I don't know, 10, 13% per year. Solar is expected to get 40% cheaper over the sort of next couple of years. Electric vehicles are becoming increasingly cheap. I mean, BYD, having overtaken Tesla, is selling brand new electric cars high-quality electric cars at around $10,000 in China, right? All the bits of this system are getting cheaper. Meanwhile, the idea that you take fossil fuels, which are broadly more expensive, and then you add on the cost of unproven technology like carbon capture in order to create electrons that you get cheaper elsewhere, I don't know. It just speaks to me of a crazy addiction.
So how do you tackle this? You made the case that legacy system will continue to perpetuate itself. I mean, that's, I think, in almost every industry historically, not just in energy, that's generally been true. You rarely do find a disruptive innovation. And I wrote a book on the future of innovation as my last work in this area. What you find is very rarely do incumbents end up producing the disruptions that change the world. It's usually outsiders, those from the periphery. You're an outsider. You're from the periphery, as it were, of that traditional energy system. What's your big idea for disrupting? Other than pointing the finger at those guys over there, what's your positive contribution?
Well, I mean, we started a company 8 years ago, which today is the biggest power company in the UK. That's increasingly growing at the same pace as the UK across 5 or 6 other countries. To do this stuff, I mean, the innovations from Octopus, whether it be zero bills homes, we literally work with house builders to create homes that we underwrite. We guarantee won't get an energy bill for 5 or 10 years, and realistically, as long as you maintain the kit, forever, because they've got solar panels, a heat pump, a battery, and a smart hot water heater, and we optimize all that. Whether it be the fact that we have, in the UK alone, around 130,000 electric cars, where we give them a bespoke charging schedule every day for each car. So if you've got a load of cars on the same road, they can all charge at different times, making the most of the existing grid infrastructure, but also capturing renewables when they're abundant. Those drivers pay 7.5 pence per kilowatt hour for their electricity, which is 3 or 4 times cheaper than the grid price, because we're grabbing it in those times. And we're using the car it does 28 different jobs, like balancing the grid at the same time as grabbing the electrons. We just launched a product which will allow a lot of electric car drivers to charge for free, because when they get home and plug their car in, we'll use it, we'll soak up electrons from the grid when they're cheap, we'll dump some back onto the grid when they're expensive, and then we'll grab some more when they're cheap for driving. So
you're able to arbitrage to find an economic value proposition, whereas the customer gets exactly the service that they ask for.
Yeah,
There's no loss for them.
No loss for them. I mean, the great news, actually, by the way, is quite the opposite.
They get a profit, as it were.
Yeah, so some more features of this system, right? And this is just at the beginning of this system.
Right.
But, first of all, that first product I talked about equates to £2.30 for 100 miles in the UK at the moment, whereas fossil fuels will be up to £20 for 100 miles. I.e., when you ask what we do, this isn't about criticising the fossil fuel industry. Today I have to fly for work quite a lot, and indeed for leisure as well. I rely on fossil fuels. I just don't expect them to create the innovations that I'm describing around electrification. By the way, I think there are 2 or 3 things we could say here. The first is, I think, look, wishful thinking is the greatest enemy of shareholder value. We saw it with companies like Blockbuster and Borders, that when the internet came along and new rivals came along, they basically crossed their fingers and told themselves the story that, for example, customers would always want the physical medium. They'd always want to be able to go in the store. And if they said if at some point it looks like these internet rivals start being successful, we'll just buy them. But of course, by the time they woke up, it was too late. They could never afford, and they were doomed. And I think the reality for executives is to think about, to be realistic about what's happening. So I was speaking to the senior people from a large fossil fuel company, one that runs not only its own exploration and production, but also a lot of petrol stations. Mm-hmm. And they said, no, don't worry, we'll just turn the petrol stations into EV charging. I said, well, you do know that 80% of EV charging happens at home or at work. And they were like, our research is different. And that's the kind of thing I heard when I was speaking to those companies that were disrupted by the internet in the early days. Our research is different. Anyway, so part of this really is saying, look, we've got these colossally sophisticated organizations. You mentioned earlier that maybe our grid can't cope. During the energy crisis, Germany built 5 liquid natural gas terminals, in less than a year. That is the astonishing power of fossil fuel companies to execute. Right? And by the way, when it comes to financing, I was talking to the CEO of a very large European fossil fuel company. And he said, look, and this is true, by the way, and forgive me for slagging everyone off, I mean, it's just in order to be helpful. He said, look, a lot of utilities are quite lazy. They basically never had to take a big risk. He said, my company, we risk billions on building new exploration production and new facilities. And we do that without any government guarantees of revenue. We do it against future market risk. And I think, what he was describing there was a huge advantage fossil fuel companies have got, that they could move into this world, which is their ability to be able to make big investments against market risks. Because one observation is that, today, a lot of the move to renewables has been driven by government guarantees. Now, are we really going to create an entire new energy system entirely driven by government guarantees? Probably not. So I think, actually, it's really interesting. There's a bunch of skills and capabilities in the fossil fuel industry which could be transformatively helpful in this world.
You mentioned the grid. This has been a topic already today. It's sort of a commonplace to say we need to double or triple the energy grid to sustain all of the electrification in the future. There is some pushback to this, given the fact that we can hardly build anything anywhere. Do you think that there are solutions emerging from electrification, from efficiency of end use? Can you give us maybe upgrading existing wires, or are there some clever tricks you have up your sleeve, you and other disruptors, that might help us avoid the task of tripling the size of the power grid, which seems a daunting task?
Yeah, I mean, well, it shouldn't seem a daunting task, right? As I said, if you looked at Germany's ability to build liquid natural gas plants when it wanted to, they could just do it.
But to be fair, those were floating offshore, not in the middle of someone's rustic countryside estate. So the people didn't object. The problem, we have seen the enemy. The enemy is us, right? Each one of us is what NIMBY is, right? NIMBYism.
Yeah, I mean, they'd each been tied up in planning bureaucracy for years before being unleashed during the crisis. And the reality was that just in a crisis, people made decisions which they don't make outside of that. Some people might argue we're in a fossil fuel crisis now. We just heard from a powerful activist. I think 2023 saw the most extreme 12 months of weather for 125,000 years. And by the way, look, this is exponential. It only gets worse every year. It gets more worse every year, pardon the grammar. But look, there is enormous amounts we can do to get more out of the existing system. Great examples. I was talking earlier about all that dynamic charging of EVs.
Right.
We can dynamically charge EVs, we can run heat pumps dynamically, we can run industrial processes dynamically, all of which can flatten the load on a grid. And that's really important because the amount of cable you need in a grid is basically driven by the peak demand. So if you can lower the peaks, you need less infrastructure. But we should also note that, again, this new energy system we're building will have in the way that no one saw the consequence of, for cabs, of the launch of the iPhone. There's so many consequences people haven't yet seen from this. So a good example would be, today, there's a 10-year moratorium on building data centers to the west of London. This is very unfortunate for the UK, by the way, because we've got this explosion in computing requirements for AI, and Slough has the greatest concentration of data centers in Europe, and yet we can't build any. Meanwhile, we spent £3 billion last year turning off wind farms in Scotland when it's windy, ostensibly because we don't have enough grid to carry the electricity to England where the demand is. But, as economists, we might think, well, price signals could help. Now, if instead of paying wind farms to turn off, we gave Scotland cheap electricity, then not only would the people of Scotland benefit from the renewable revolution, but actually those data centers that are queuing up to build in London, or to the west of London, would start locating to where the cheap energy was. It's a lot easier to run a fibre than it is to run grid.
Right.
So in the same way that steel and iron moved to where you had iron ore and coal, so uses of electricity will move to where we've got renewables. By the way, a recent paper by FTI Consulting for Ofgem in the UK said that if we had regional pricing of electricity in the UK, Scotland would have the cheapest electricity in Europe. Wales and Northern England would do very well as well. And every region will be cheaper than it is today. Our electricity system today, with a single national price, resembles the wine lakes and butter mountains of the EEC.
Well, on that colorful analogy, I'm going to bring our session to a close because we're over time. But it is a good call for rethinking how we do regulation, for incentives, getting prices right. I think that's a good note for an economist audience. So thanks so much, Greg. We appreciate it. Give a round of applause.
Okay, thank you very much.
You bet. Please.